Dobrý podvečer, vážené dámy, vážení páni. Dovolte mi, aby som vás privítal na tretej v poradí, tretej prednáške z nášho cyklu Revisited, Revised a Revisited v jednom slove. Som veľmi rád, že môžem dnes tu privítať profesorku dejín umenia z Univerzity v Johannesburgu Karen von W., ktorá už tu je pripravená. A bude hovoriť o výstave, ktorú kurátorovala, ktorá skončila len pred niekoľkými dňami. By som na úvod iba chcel povedať, že poznáme sa s Karen von W. jeden rok, približne, viac ako jeden rok. Stretli sme sa trikrát, ona bola v Lani pozvaná aj na medzinárodný kongres AICA, ktorý u nás prebehol. Ja som ako prvý od nej čítal text, v ktorom pojednávala spôsoby, akými sa juhoafrickí umelci vyrovnávali s témou apartheidu a akým spôsobom subverzívne pracovali s touto témou reálne v tom čase, od 70. rokov. A bolo to veľmi zaujímavé, že vlastne apartheid, ktorý pramení z kresťanskej ideológie, respektíve je zdôvodnený kresťanstvom a tak bol vykladaný celú dobu v Južnej Afrike, tak vlastne tí umelci používali kresťanskú ikonografiu a kresťanské témy práve na to, aby rozbíjali túto ako keby nespochybniteľnosť jeho oprávnenosti apartheidu v Južnej Afrike. Táto dnešná prednáška je už o umelcoch súčasných, ktorí sa venujú tomu, akým spôsobom sú tieto témy reflektované dnes, čo sa reálne zmenilo. U nás bola revolúcia v roku 1989, u nich 94. Čo sa reálne zmenilo, čo z toho zostalo, čo pretrvá v akej podobe. Tak mám pocit, že pre nás to môže byť veľmi, veľmi zaujímavé. Ste tu viacerí, ktorí ste sa vo svojej práci dotkli alebo pracujete s témami, ktoré spadajú do tejto oblasti. A mám pocit, že to, čo ona bude prezentovať, je jedno asi z mála možno dnes na svete, kde intenzívne v súčasnom umeleckom diskurze funguje kresťanská ikonografia. Mali sme tu mať ešte jedného hostia, riaditeľku Inštitútu ikonografické štúdie v Rieke, ale bohužiaľ je zaseknutá na ceste medzi Wiener Neustadt a Viedňou v dopravnej zápche, takže sa jej nakoniec sem prísť medzi nás nepodarilo. I'm very happy to have you here, and it's your turn.
Thank you. Is this on? The button's on, the light is on. Okay. Can you hear me? Yes. Good evening, everyone, and thank you very much to Richard and Uri for inviting me here to speak tonight. I'm going to talk about an exhibition that has just closed in Johannesburg, and I'm going to start with a fairly lengthy quote by Aidan Nichols, which encapsulates what I'm going to talk about this evening. In the texture of the Bible lies embedded a metaphor of vital significance for the scriptures as a whole, that of man made in the image of God, and of Jesus in particular as the image of the invisible God. We can hardly expect to grasp the sense and the scope of this metaphor unless we have some fairly adequate notion of how art subserves the human search for meaning and truth. For these metaphorical utterances are appealing to none other than man's experience of art. David Morgan, in The Sacred Gaze, a study of religious visual culture, notes that seeing is a sacred practice in many different religions. He also explains that vision is part of a cultural experience. So a study of religious imagery must include an understanding of the strength of traditions, practices, attitudes, and habits that inform the gaze, and thus inform cultural responses to such a social act of looking. These habits and traditions are investigated in this presentation, in which historical reasons for the emotive intensity accorded to religious iconography are considered. I will then look at the use of such imagery by South African artists who took part in an exhibition curated by me, which had as its theme contemporary responses to social conditions through the medium of Christian iconography. Like you in Slovakia, we in South Africa have emerged from a period of totalitarian regime under the apartheid policies of the old nationalist government, and at the moment we're celebrating our 20th year of democracy. The transitional period has been neither smooth nor idyllic, however, and as a nation we engage daily with changing social and political hierarchies. Personal safety is sometimes in dispute, and we endlessly negotiate what and who we are, where we stand, and what we remember as our post-apartheid society tries to reinvent itself. The artists in deconstructing dogma choose to employ religious iconography because it has been implicated in the social control of populations for centuries, with the conflation of church and state power. The exhibited works present personal evocations of specific Christian iconography, such as Adam and Eve, the Virgin Mary, Christ, and various saints and sinners, as well as several images that relook at Old Testament stories. Many examples parody well-known artworks. Others respond to Christian icons, such as Christ, Mary, or the saints. All the works encourage viewers to engage critically with some of the underlying implications found in the original manifestations of such imagery, and in this way they investigate current inequalities in society. Religious iconography is held in high regard, even revered by some, so transgressive parodies of Christian icons can cause a strong reaction in some viewers. This presentation is an investigation into the efficacy of employing religious iconography to engage with the diverse ills of contemporary society. I first briefly consider the history of Christian imagery and the reasons for extreme responses in viewers, and then discuss selected examples from the exhibition as a rationale for the choice of artworks. It's important to understand both the history and the reverence with which religious images are held in order to understand why there's such a residue of feeling attributed to such imagery today. As specified in the quote at the beginning, the religious icon as a visual motif is metaphorically connected to the core belief of Christian dogma, in the presence of Christ as a physical, tangible, visual manifestation of spiritual force. The level of reverence accorded to a religious image grew from a long history of using symbols or signs as aids to engage with anything mystical or divine, anything that was beyond the scope of the physical world and which comprised religious experience. Subsequent problems leading to iconoclastic controversies in the church arose when religious adherents conflated the symbol with the referent, and this leads to suggestions of idolatry. The attempt to avoid idolatry led to many debates over the use of iconography in church practice. However, after a prolonged struggle, the Church Ecumenical Council eventually became aware of the theological possibilities inherent in religious imagery. They inferred that the icon should be more than just art, because it has virtually a sacramental power, and they believed that it could physically manifest the sacred and the numinous in a way that brings it down to earth, so to speak, within the scope of understanding and apprehension of the common man. As David Friedberg explains, the mind can only grasp the invisible by means of or with reference to the visible. An example of the powerful effect of church images in history and the way this was exploited by the church can be found during the 17th century, when there was an escalation of religious fervour aided by ritual and imagery, that began in Italy and spread across the Western world during the era now identified as Baroque. Church buildings, sculptures, paintings, incense, music, singing, a glorious spectacle of procession by richly garbed celebrants, formed a spectacle of complexity and grandeur, designed to appeal emotionally to a church congregation. This profusion of media working in concert created a total work of art that aimed to transport the congregation into an otherworldly religious experience. Such an appeal to the senses and emotions deliberately used every aesthetic means at the disposal of the church hierarchy to draw people back into Catholicism at a time of increasing Protestant activity around Europe. The church was thus promoting the spiritual efficiency of art expediently for its own purposes, against rival religious offshoots, as much as it was promoting spirituality itself. Church teaching became secondary to ritual, and importance was placed on glorifying the Catholic Church, not only by producing impressive monuments, but also by all the means that lay in the power of the figurative arts to attest to the truth of the faith. Emotive imagery, seen in the Ecstasy of Saint Teresa by Bernini, or Rubens' Descent from the Cross, for example, were equated with emotional fervour, ecstatic experience, and doctrinal truth, and this effect continued for centuries. Small wonder then that religious imagery continues to cling to its traces of that emotive content for some viewers. In his lecture on iconoclasts and their motives, Friedberg suggests that iconic images are invested with power through the associations they carry, rather than through the dialectic relationship between image and beholder. The power of the religious icon is attested to by a long history of carefully controlled similar images, suggesting continuity and potency, and thus producing an aura of truth through repetition that is exploited by the institutions of both church and state. The continued strength of these religious associations and the truths that they represent are identified in vehement public responses to works that are deemed transgressive. A work that was produced by genius and that is aesthetically beautiful and portrays the idealism of classical perfection, such as the Pieta by Michelangelo, could be said to carry an aura of spiritual communication, particularly as its purpose was for religious contemplation. The parody of this work by Diane Victor in Little Deposition Picture might therefore be seen as an attack not only on the image of the Virgin Mary as a person and on religion in general, but also on the sanctity of the creative urge, artistic genius, historical ideals, tradition, and culture. This is not an image that must be absorbed in rapt contemplation, but must be comprehended rationally with intellectual knowledge of historical prototypes and their meanings, and in response to a current political or social context. It is therefore decidedly worldly in purpose and effect. This image was considered so offensive when it was first exhibited at an arts festival in Paarl that an unidentified vandal tore the drawing in half, and you can see the tear from top to bottom in the image there. Victor considers such extreme reactions complimentary because they indicate, she believes, the success of her attempts to present provocative imagery that disrupts complacent viewing. A similar effect can be seen in other examples of parodic reworking of Michelangelo's Pieta, as you see here with Derek Zietzmann's Revisiting Pieta, or Conrad Beuter's Pieta. Morgan's list of the functions of religious imagery and religious visual practices demonstrates that, amongst other things, they influence thought and behavior. And John de Grouchy reinforces this when he says, images play a fundamental role in the shaping of cultural and religious identity, and in the construction, subverting, and transforming of social reality. This suggests that beyond purely religious purposes, power and social control can be constructed and reinforced through religious iconography. A study of religious images, therefore, must include their ability to forcefully propagate ideas and expectations for the circumscribed behavior of their adherents, a purpose that has encouraged the appropriation of religious truths reinforced by religious imagery as a political tool. Michel Foucault's notion of power in the modern world as something that produces reality and truth could perhaps guide the viewer's response to the artworks selected for this exhibition, Dekonštrukcia Dogma, in terms of discovering exactly what truth is being presented in the religious originals and how that truth is being iconoclastically questioned or overturned through quotation and parody. So now I'll talk about the works actually on the exhibition. You've seen some of them, I'll be showing you some more. Some examples on the exhibition directly parody well-known artworks, such as the ones I've just mentioned, and several versions of Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper. Others create alternative versions of icons or engage with didactic stories like Cain and Abel or Abraham and Isaac. The works are created for the specific purpose of encouraging viewers to engage critically with some of the underlying implications found in the original versions. Their content is extremely diverse, so for organizational purposes, I've divided them according to the biblical protagonists, and I'm going to start with images of Adam and Eve. So there are a number of examples on the exhibition that investigate the construction of both female and male identities, such as Gordon Froude's Adam and Eve, which parodies the notion of biologically determined gender difference, or Christine Dixie's Balding's Adam and Eve into Our Separate Pasts, where power relations between men and women are considered within the framework of a feminist discourse on the gaze. Dixie notes that the relations of power in looking are so embedded in social and cultural forms that even when roles are reversed, the relations of power are not so easily changed. Thus, the woman in this image peeps from behind the man while he's the confident possessor of the gaze, who judgmentally watches the first woman, Eve, who is possessed then by both his gaze and our gaze and Adam's caress. Both Dixie and Mayak Bradell consider the way that women have been used as a vehicle for moralizing by the church, and in subsequent depictions by artists. Bradell's diptych of Eve not guilty and Magdalene not guilty refer to this tradition of apportioning blame to women over the centuries. The biblical story of the fall indicates that both Adam and Eve were punished for their disobedience, and both of them were exiled from Eden. But Marina Warner, in her book Alone of All Her Sex, The Myth and the Cult of the Virgin Mary, explains that for the fathers of the church after Augustine, the woman is the cause of the fall, the wicked temptress, the accomplice of Satan, and the destroyer of mankind. Eve's vilification is seen in the following quote from Tertullian in the 2nd to 3rd century AD, and I'm quoting now. "Do you not realize, Eve, that it is you? The curse God pronounced on your sex weighs still on the world. Guilty, you must bear its hardships. You are the devil's gateway. You desecrated the fatal tree. You first betrayed the law of God. You softened up with your cajoling words the man against whom the devil could not prevail by force. The image of God, Adam, you broke him as if he were a plaything. You deserved death, but it was the Son of God who had to die." That's the end of Tertullian's quote. Now, this notion was so common by the 16th century that when Michelangelo was painting the Eden scene on the Sistine Chapel ceiling, he depicted the snake-like Satan as a rather muscular woman. You can see she's got a breast. So he was visually entrenching an attitude that developed from a biased interpretation of the original scripture. Right, now we have Virgin and Madonna images. Through the sin of Eve, the sin of sexuality, and this I put sin in inverted commas here, was also largely considered a function of womanly nature, and to maintain patriarchal control, an emphasis on purity, sexual abstinence, and preferably virginity was promoted in church doctrine via the Virgin Mary. Her resulting elevation in religious dogma as the perfect role model is parodied by Julie Lovelace's I Am No Superwoman, a kitsch statuette of the Virgin in garish colours, balanced atop a silver ball, looking decorative rather than purposeful. She functions as a commentary on countless heroic statues and images of the Virgin Mary, positioned on a globe representing the world and victoriously trampling the serpent of original sin. The sin of woman's sexuality was considered so problematic that even the results, pregnancy and childbirth, were presented negatively by the early church. Both menstruation and the abject aspects of parturition, which Augustine referred to as the feces and the urine of childbirth, were considered evidence of woman's closeness to all that is vile, lowly, corruptible, and material. Bradell counters Augustine's proof of the defilement of woman by glorifying all aspects of procreation and parturition, evidenced in her series of Black Madonna etchings, which moreover present us with the birth of a girl child, thus problematizing the notion of a male savior for humanity. Bradell explains, and I quote, "As a lapsed Calvinist and a dissident daughter of the patriarchy, I am episodically in dialogue with the nagging question of how our interior landscape would be different if the prevailing religious icon was a woman giving birth rather than a man dying on a cross. Bradell's women express a positive sexual energy, even when entirely clothed, as in the Annunciation Virgin painting. The garment covering the Virgin's body from neck to floor clings suggestively to her projecting breasts and parts over her belly to reveal a mandorla-shaped opening that exposes an intense red, implying heat and life, which seem to pulsate and glow through the cloth. Her fingers are stained with the red, suggesting that she has ripped apart her wound to actively receive the blessing that is inscribed on her face and around her head in the words of the Annunciation angel. Her willing collusion in this overtly sexual experience negates the timid passivity and reluctance displayed by traditional Virgin Marys or Madonnas depicted in so many church altarpieces and Annunciation scenes. Christine Dixie approaches her interpretation of the Madonna from a very personal point of view, as the works in Dekonštrukcia dogma were made in response to her experiences of pregnancy and the birth of her second child in 2005. The largest work in the project, Parturient Prospects, the Interior, takes its inspiration from an early colonial map of Africa from 1648. Dixie has replaced the continent of Africa with a large central image of a woman's body that has been sliced open and spread out to reveal her interior organs, particularly those relating to reproduction. Early colonial discourses on exploration into Africa likened the continent to the unknown internal workings of the human body, a female body in particular. The use of female imagery for Africa was also important in determining its status as inferior. In Europe, women were conceptualized as other and inferior to men through an established division of labor and through biology, particularly the biological fact of childbearing. Africa was therefore constructed in terms of opposition to Europe, particularly the European male, who was superior, reasoning, self-contained, and above all civilized. The central image here is flanked by small rectangular blocks which are reworked fragments taken from Annunciation prototypes and Madonna and Child paintings. The upper images show the Angel Gabriel's hands on the left-hand side and the Madonna's hands and stomach on the right. Below these are details of the child on the left and the Madonna's breast on the right, completing each aspect of a woman's otherness through their link with conception, maternity, and nurture. The Annunciation images in their original manifestation refer to Christ's sinless, sexless conception, and therefore emphasize purity, chastity, and restraint. But their fragmentation in these small panels and the surgical implements held by Gabriel instead of his floral tributes evokes a more sinister interpretation. The implements could imply painful medical procedures during childbirth, although they look suspiciously like crochet hooks or something used to perform abortions. The medical instruments, and there you can see some more of them, also seen in the accompanying reliquary boxes, were taken from illustrations of implements used for eye surgery. And Dixie chose them specifically to refer to gazing as sexual possession. Sexuality as an inherent part of conception is also indicated by the disembodied hands and fragments of the Madonna's body that infer a process of seduction through touch and caress. The lower three panels on either side are also fragments taken from Renaissance prototypes, but in this case the left three panels, originally showing the Christ child supported by his mother's hands, now proudly display a female child. The gender shift is significant in terms of the history of religious imagery. Numerous Renaissance images of the Madonna and the Christ child show him naked, more often than clothed, and Leo Steinberg notes that the display of the Christ child's genitals, and you can see it here in this image, and you can see it in that image as well, is important because it demonstrates that he is fully human in every way. Fully male, because he's simultaneously God, he's shameless in his nakedness. This effort to foreground a fully male saviour, who is both God and man, is questioned then by Dixie, who, like Riddell, wonders how our history might be different if the saviour had been female. The power inherent in the gaze is also referred to here, as the bodies of naked women have traditionally been the passive subjects of a male appropriating gaze, whereas the naked Christ child displays the promise of his ability to actively fulfill God's plan. Dixie questions the legitimacy of this power by removing the purpose of the gaze, so it can neither witness the proof of a deity, because it's now a girl child, nor function as a precursor to appropriation. Opposite these three panels, Dixie has placed three images of the Madonna's breast, also taken from Renaissance originals, but with the child and the larger context removed, so the breasts become sexually charged instead of merely nurturing. Now to Christ images. Wim Botha's Christ figure, in commune suspension of disbelief, is made of Bibles and Bible text. That's this one that you saw at the beginning of the talk. Those Bibles and Bible texts are in the 11 official languages of South Africa. Botha is not interested in religion per se, but in different modes, visual and verbal, by which a religious truth can affect society. He engages with the notion of God as an insubstantial idea, translated into language, that is the word, which is firstly spoken and then written down, and how those words are used as rules to guide and control human behavior. The words, as Bibles, present in concrete form, are the central biblical message of salvation. And now it becomes a Christ figure, suspended as if on the cross. He is surrounded by surveillance cameras to indicate a population in the Big Brother is watching you tradition. So state and religion are conflated in terms of their controlling effect on society. However, the camera images shown on the screens are increasingly fuzzy and unfocused, so so the concrete image is rendered unintelligible and loses meaning in its final incarnation. One could perhaps say that this work encapsulates the theme of this exhibition, the deconstruction of dogma. Botha's installation has exposed an assurance built up over centuries that certain rules and actions are inherently right and therefore enforceable. Yet simultaneously he erodes the necessary confidence that should underpin their enforcement and replaces it with doubt and uncertainty. Doubt is a necessary ingredient, promoting the reflection and self-awareness required for creating a more tolerable future regime. Ironically, therefore, Botha's expose of past dogmas, instituted by the conflation of state and ecumenical regulations, has an end result not too different from the initial motivation of religious faith in its function as a catalyst for change and self-enlightenment. In South Africa, an awareness and acceptance of gendered discourses in public arenas outside of academia coincided with the post-apartheid era and the demise of Afrikaner political hegemony. A mere 4 years after Afrikaner nationalism was replaced by democracy, we see this loss depicted in Conrad Botha's parodic Christ-like martyr from the front of the Best of Bitter Comics. It's a comic book series that he was one of the illustrators for. The patriotic and religious tattoos on the pseudo-martyr's body illustrate the Afrikaners' fears of the loss of their heritage, their power, and their economic dominance due to affirmative action. Botha presents us with the antithesis of white supremacy, standing pitifully in a graveyard of Afrikaans political leaders and crying out to a God who has forsaken him and his belief system. The loss of economic and political power in patriarchal Afrikanerdom impacted unavoidably on personal and family relationships and sometimes resulted in a diminished identification of male identity or loss of male stature in the community. Conrad Botha has chosen to explore this loss and find an opportunity to reinvent masculinity from his own perspective in The Good Shepherd. In a parody of traditional images showing a long-haired Jesus cradling a lamb, Botha presents Jesus cradling a penis, surrounded by images alluding to masculine fantasies of sexuality and machismo. Botha's version of Christ is guaranteed to disturb the sensibilities of Christian viewers who were brought up on the saccharine version that was its prototype. Yet this is not Botha's intent. He is merely employing a recognizable male icon to comment on the type of macho person masculinity that is promoted by Afrikaner nationalism. Similarly, Derek Zietzman's series of etchings also explore and parody white Afrikaner Calvinist patriarchy and conservative values, particularly how these repressive values attempt to construct what Christian and decent gender performative behavior should be. In imagery that deliberately flouts religious conventions, Zietzman questions relationships between his lived experience in contemporary South Africa and the historic tendency to accept white Afrikaner Calvinist values without question. Zietzman explains, and I quote, "I visually explore the impact of the legacy of apartheid violence, the history of Afrikaner nationalism, and the permeation of racial politics on the performativities of white people. Through transgressive interpretations of the attributes of white Afrikaner Calvinist values, I satirize both historic performativities of patriarchal arrogance and a post-apartheid uncertainty brought on by the changes in the social and political environment. The images in the series of 5 prints on paper serve as metaphors for South Africa's history of religious nationalism, repressive patriarchal values, and racial oppression enforced through Calvinistic teaching. Lawrence Leboana also approaches alternative masculinities in his delightful parody of Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper, entitled The Discussion. The feminine floral setting is offset by an incongruous rugby goalpost framing the head of Christ. The pink-clad figures are all repetitions of the same model, Nkosinati Kuve, perhaps referring to the way the racial other has been historically been homogenized in colonial discourse. But Lemoine is mocking such stereotypes with his camp rugby players in their hyper-real setting, who question notions of religious sexuality and culture. In his works, Lemoine interrogates the way masculinity is performed to fulfill social expectations. Theodore Cohen explains in the discussion of the formation of male identity that, broadly speaking, boys learn that being male means being strong, competitive, aggressive, inexpressive, and courageous. They further learn that masculinity is tightly connected to their heterosexuality. Lemoine's hyperbolic, pink-clad, flower-laden rugby players poke fun at the hallowed masculinity of the rugby fraternity, while simultaneously commenting seriously on social hierarchies that men contend with in South African society. Right, now we get on to patriarchs, martyrs, and saints. Conrad Goethe's series of Cain and Abel images from 2009 are, in Goethe's works, a political allegory told through a well-known and widely understood biblical historical medium. The story of Cain and Abel is the first murder recorded in history according to the Bible. It follows directly after the expulsion of Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden. And Jan Bremner suggests that it is an indication of the fragility of fraternal relationships, which are often subject to the sin of envy. If one takes the notion of the brotherhood of Cain and Abel as a metaphor for the brotherhood of man, in a broader sense, then the level of envy and the consequent violence escalates exponentially, further exacerbated by elements of racial tension introduced by Goethe. His interpretation differs markedly from the biblical version and takes on a particularly South African emphasis in the presentation of an Abel who is large, strong, white, and apparently superior both physically and politically, the latter indicated in his direct communication with God. Blatant social inequalities and the arrogance of Abel are presented not necessarily as a just cause, but as mitigating factors for Cain's actions. And we're left at the end feeling sorry for the wretched Cain weeping over his brother's grave in the barren desert. Unlike the comic book images with a developmental narrative, the individual reverse glass painting is more open-ended, and the possibilities for interpretation within the thematic context are greater. Abel inscribes the mark of Cain as violent pictograms all over his brother's body, to set him apart and identify him as other, in the same way as skin pigmentation and physiognomy has functioned in colonized lands. Ironically, the mark of Cain was originally decreed by God as an emblem of protection from murder, in fact, during Cain's exile. But here it appears as a painful punishment, possibly a form of scarification or many tattoos, in Goethe's words like shrapnel under the skin. To take the story of Cain and Abel to its ultimate conclusion, Goethe turns his attention to a Last Judgment Gothic stained glass window entitled On Earth as It Is in Heaven. This work is apparently inspired by art historical examples of a biblical judgment day, such as Rubens' Fall of the Damned, for example, where unworthy mankind is damned by God and cast into hell. Unlike the drama of Rubens' version, Goethe's graphic style allows for the insertion of clues to the sins that these people have committed, and it creates an image that becomes almost humorous in its childlike overstatement. In the context of the Cain and Abel works, it is the promise of judgment and damnation that will befall Cain and which causes his despair. In a wider sense, however, it refers to the devastating effects of greed and corruption that is rife in South African society and politics, alluded to by the diamonds in the image that represent the mining wealth in South Africa that inspired rapid colonization in the 19th century. Diane Victor also considers the effects of violence, particularly towards women, in her Gothic window triptych, No Country for Old Women, and that is actually the artist herself walking in front of the triptych. It's an enormous piece. The work documents some recent infamous examples of the rape, murder, and mutilation of women, showing a hell on earth rather than a nebulous future punishment. Victor's working method of drawing using candle smoke is also evocative of the fragility of these lives that have been lost or damaged. Smoke drawings are notoriously fragile. One touch can just remove the soot and permanently damage the image. And I've put here these images of her actually doing smoke drawings on paper, where she holds the candle underneath the paper and the smoke leaves drawn marks. And then she works into it with a brush or a fine scratching tool, just to take off and put in detail, and then puts on more candle marks. On paper it's quite difficult because the paper can actually catch fire. Now of course she did this with glass panels instead of paper for the work that I'm talking about, and that required her to actually set up a kind of system to suspend the glass above her head, because smoke goes up, and she needed the smoke to go up and actually draw onto the glass with that. So she had to have a system to tilt the glass above her head when she was working on these. On glass, the smoke drawing gives an eerie, ghostly quality, as if the people are already spirits rather than living human beings. They visually dissolve. So the medium actually enhances the meaning of this artwork. On the right of the central group is, in fact I'll leave it on this one, on the right of the central group there, you can see it on this right-hand panel, is the victim of a gang rape and murder through disembowelment. Her name was Anian Boysons, and her ordeal made newspaper headlines for months last year. So here Diane has shown her dressed in her own intestines and placed in her coffin-like panel beside less well-known current victims of atrocities. On the far left, and in the detail image on the left-hand side there, is Victor's own aunt, an 82-year-old lady called Angela Reardon, who was murdered by robbers and hidden in a shallow grave in the garden so they could come back and finish clearing out her house without her interrupting them. This murder of a helpless, vulnerable old woman inspired the title of the work, but as Victor notes, it is all women who seem to be disposable, hence the inclusion of a small child among the victims on the right-hand side. If I go back, you can see the small child on the right-hand side there. I just lost my place, sorry. The Medical Research Council reports that South Africa has a female homicide rate 6 times the global average, with half the murdered women killed by an intimate partner. According to the Human Rights Watch report from 1995, our rape figures are among the highest reported for any country that is not at war. In addition, there are violent hate crimes such as the rape and murder of black lesbians that have been reported in Cape Town and Johannesburg since 2007. One victim of these crimes is depicted by Victor with a bruised, beaten face, and her lower half is clothed in a coyote skin, referring to the motto, "Give a dog a bad name and hang it." Jackie McInnes engages with similar content in her representation of Lot's wife, and she calls it Wife's Lot. Rather than memorializing specific crimes, she embodies the submissive ideal that has been promoted as acceptable female behavior through both Old and New Testament scriptures. The story of Lot is difficult reading as he offers his virgin daughters to the men of Sodom to save 2 male visitors from being sexually assaulted by the townspeople. This work draws on the historic disregard for women's rights. As McInnes explains, and I quote, "Wife's Lot, a cast salt sculpture of a female form in a pose as submissive as it is provocative, explores the subtext within this biblical story. Can it not be argued that Lot's utter disregard for the sanctity of the bodies of his virginal daughters sanctions, or at very least normalizes, a patriarchal social stance, not unduly perturbed by all this violent and sexual assaults that are perpetrated against women?" End of quote. The violence of this story is alluded to in McInnes's photographs of the casting process, which appear particularly brutal, with the passive model quite literally manhandled while maintaining her uncomfortably submissive pose. The 2 visitors, who are angels in disguise in the Lot story, warn Lot to flee from the destruction of Sodom and not look behind him, but his disobedient wife does look behind, so she's punished for her disobedience by being turned into a pillar of salt. Hence the choice of casting material. McInnes indicates that this sculpture also references the social ills faced by refugees in South Africa, who, having been forced to flee from their countries of origin, like Lot fleeing from Sodom, now face xenophobic persecution. She points out that the pose of the figure consciously echoes that of Ernesto Alfabito Namuve, who was burned alive in an orgy of xenophobic violence in Ramaphosa squatter camp on the East Rand of Johannesburg on the 18th of May in 2008. This is the reason that burnt tire soot is used as the drawing medium for her working drawing of Wife's Lot. Christian Diedrichs similarly pursues a dystopian vision of South Africa in its social and political landscape, and his works raise awareness of rape, greed, gluttony, without being obvious or literal. Diedrichs explains that the content of St. Mary MacKillop, for example, deals with the construction of both female and male identities, as well as proposed sexual and social roles, the abuse of power by male role models, especially in the Catholic Church, and bigotry still existing in many religious institutions, and the alarming issue of rape in South Africa and globally. Mary MacKillop was an Australian nun who reported a case of sexual abuse by a monk and was excommunicated from the church in retaliation for her outspokenness, although the punishment was later revoked by the bishop on his deathbed. Diedrichs ascribes her treatment to the reaction of those upholding patriarchal power systems, and he includes the church amongst those systems. People who feel threatened by powerful or free-thinking women. He goes on to note that any whistleblower, particularly when addressing something as incendiary as crimes of sexual abuse, then or now, is bound to face serious, even extreme opposition. In the church, revealing the truth to power rarely reaped gratitude from those to whom the truth is told. The flame over her head belies the submissive tilt of her head and evokes the irony of her subsequent canonization by the Catholic Church. It is an aggressive symbol of passion, the cleansing flame of action rather than the more traditional, rounded, contained, circular halo preferred through centuries of religious iconography. The small dancing dogs that you can see in the background are linear and decorative, perhaps referring to the insubstantial or decorative roles ascribed to women, and their submissive bowing stance echoes the tilted head of the saint. There is also a reference here to women as interchangeable bitches, perhaps, something to be owned and dismissed as irrelevant in the greater scheme of things. The companion piece to St. Mary MacKillop is St. Aloysius Gonzaga, and it commemorates the victims of male rape and gay bashing. In a country that's been described, as I said, as the rape capital of the world, it's unsurprising that men would also fall victim to this form of violence. Yet male rape has been overlooked by the South African authorities and has in fact only recently been classified correctly. Previously it was identified as an indecent assault. According to Diedrichs, male rape is rife in South African prisons, yet is often unreported due to intimidation. Many men contract the HIV virus while being raped, both in and out of prison. And Diedrichs also points to a study conducted by the Medical Research Council, which shows that almost 10% of South African men have experienced sexual violence by another man. The lack of government or official response given to such incidents is perhaps indicative of the prevailing belief in Africa that being gay is somehow un-African. In South Africa, we have a Bill of Rights. It is one that expressly prohibits the discrimination of anybody on the grounds of sexual orientation. Despite these constitutional rights, our own president, President Zuma, stated at a Heritage Day public meeting in 2006 that same-sex marriages were a disgrace to the nation and to God. At the same meeting he pronounced, "When I was growing up, homosexuals could not stand in front of me." In other words, he would have punched them in the face. South Africa's lack of response to the criminalizing of homosexual acts in Uganda this year is an indication of the continued lack of will to take a stand against such discrimination. It suggests that homophobia continues to be perpetrated under the guise of African traditional values. Saint Aloysius Gonzaga gave up his wealthy life to become a Jesuit priest, caring tirelessly for the sick and dying in a terrible epidemic that struck Rome in 1591. He too succumbed to the illness and died, and recently AIDS patients and their caregivers have adopted Saint Aloysius Gonzaga as their patron. Diedrichs believes that this saint would also be an appropriate patron saint for the male rape victims, and the content of this work specifically investigates the misappropriation of male power, dominance, and muzzled traditional male sexual and social roles, the abuse of power, and an inflicted silence as a direct result of these things. Now we reach the conclusion. As you can see, Christian iconography is replete with ideological meanings, interpretations, and expectations that have imbued religious imagery over centuries. Such meaning is familiar to most Western people, even if they're not currently religious. And many of the images are also familiar through reproductions in art history books and popular publications. So religious imagery is a perfect vehicle for parodic reinvention, for parody in other words. The strength of meaning inherent in the original also ensures that parodic transformation would create an equally powerful impact on the viewer, as there appears to be a direct correlation between the effect of religious content in a work and the ironic effect of its parody. Whatever form the work takes, this self-reflexive mode of art making engages both the past and the present in what is often a critical response to both. Are there any questions? And I would need to put my glasses on so I can see you. Can we have the lights on maybe?
It's very difficult.
Oh, all right, never mind. I'm just blinded, so if anyone puts their hands up for a question, you better shout.
I have a question.
Okay.
It's nobody asking. So, I didn't see it before as a presentation for whole exhibition now. So it's mainly about representing. It's in depiction. All the pictures were figurative art.
Yes.
Why is it so? Is it
because these artists are using religious iconography, and if you look historically at the history, and a lot of them are doing it from an art historical point of view, but the history of religious imagery has always been a history of putting abstract thoughts into concrete images. It was a form of didacticism. It was there to teach people. so that they could, particularly in the years when people were mostly illiterate, the imagery was there to reinforce the message. So it had to be understandable, and it had to be something that they could relate to. It couldn't be an abstract pen. In fact, abstract art wasn't invented way back then. So it is a history of images that are figurative images. That is, if you look back through the church, that's what you've got. It's only in the 20th century you come to images which are trying to be spiritual without figurative elements in them. So it is inherently a topic that requires figurative imagery, and they are taking a history of images that everybody is used to and then trying to do something else with them that speaks to us on a contemporary basis in terms of social problems and contemporary issues.
So it's always so appellative. It's never kind of metaphoric or...
Well, these images are all metaphoric, but they're metaphoric using specific imagery. So they carry meanings. In fact, there's one I didn't talk about that I'll just go back to, and I'll just explain this issue to you because it's back here when we get to the beginning. This one. This one, for example, is talking about religious practices and belief systems from a Western point of view, and religious practices and belief systems from an African point of view. So the religious Western image, the Virgin Mary, is tied onto a horse, which has actually got one of the blankets that they use in Burkina Faso when they do shamanic dances. And they start dancing and trying to get into a trance. They wear these clothes and masks and have the cowrie shells, which are around the horse's ankles, to make that rhythmic beat when they dance. And in ancient times, if you look at rock paintings, sand rock paintings, for example, you will see that the people believe when they get into a trance that they actually become a spirit animal. So it's no longer a person who is doing a dance with an animal mask on. They actually become that animal on another plane. So the horse's head there is a mask. There's a human eye inside. And the hands are human hands in the front instead of horse's hooves. So the horse has become this spirit animal. It's called a therianthrope. It's a mixture of human and animal on a spiritual plane. So you've got here African belief systems and Western belief systems, and this horse is being driven out across. If you look in the shadow, you'll see there's a burned wasteland. The burned wasteland indicates the burning out of old scrubby bush and old crops and things in order to start afresh. So this is metaphorically talking about the way we need to get rid of our old traditions and our old beliefs in the new South Africa and clear the way so that we can start afresh in the new South Africa. Now that's completely metaphorical, but it's done using figurative imagery. Did I answer your question?
Yeah. Thank you very much, Fran.
Thank you. Thank you for listening, everybody.